The following broadcast was produced by the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco as part of our Lighthouse Learning Library.
I'll tell you about one of my first decisions, of course, which was where do I go to college and what do I go into? And I think back now and realize I wish some of those high school counselors had said, you know, you might want to go into a profession that'll help you get a job, because they say things like, well, follow your passion, do what you really want, what are you really good at? Yeah, that's all nice and you should consider it, but in some ways I wish they told me, be a physical therapist or something, because you can work anywhere in the world, any place. That wasn't my bailiwick, but I wish they had tempered some of the do the right thing in terms of your heart with do the right thing in terms of where you can get a job. So I went to school at University of California, Davis. I started out in electrical engineering, and I got through all the awful math and chemistry and physics, and then I realized I didn't know what I wanted to do, and engineering is a very regimented path, and I wasn't a regimented person. And so I started wandering a little bit. I took some music classes, I took some political science, I took an international relations class from this guy, Donald Rothschild, and all of a sudden the lights went on. I like that. I like international stuff, cultural differences. In some ways it relates to being blind or being a minority. You have to learn to adjust in really different situations. And then that led me to wanting to go on an international abroad program, which I mentioned yesterday, that landed me in Ghana. And at some point I said, I think I need to get out of here with a degree, because I really don't like school. This is taking forever. It's hard. I just want to be done with it. So I got a degree in political science, which was exactly one of those degrees that, what do you do with it? You can't go get a job with it. You can go to law school. So that was kind of the logical path. Should I go to law school? So I applied to law school, and I got into Davis, and then I thought, I cannot bear another 3 years in this same town. Everything's the same. It's just more school. So I decided to take a year off and bang around a little bit. And in that time, I came up here and I worked at the camp. That's a time frame when I was assistant director and did that during the summer, and actually during the off-season some I worked at the LightHouse when I was down on Howard Street. And I did a few other things and decided, well, there's no choice but to either go to law school or go back to grad school, because a political science degree is not going to really help. So I needed some time for that decision making. I applied to and got into the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And here's a decision-making process that may not seem all that brilliant in retrospect, which was, do I go to law school in Davis, or do I go to International Affairs Graduate School in Washington, D.C.? I did not choose between professions, I chose between locations. And I thought, Washington, D.C., new territory, new place, expand my network, and off I went. And that was mostly a good decision, although it presented some other problems. So I went back there, I spent my 2 years, I got my master's degree in D.C., and I really did expand my network. That's a good thing about living in another part of the world. You're forced to get out there and meet new people, and then you're not just provincial in the particular place where you've grown up or you've gone to school. And the next decision, well, now where do I work? And I applied for lots of jobs at various banks. International loan programs tended to be where a lot of my colleagues went. So I applied at Chase and Intercontinental Bank and all these different locations. And I rarely got anybody that says, we'll hire you. They always said, I think the department next door would really be amazed by you. So I got more job interviews than my colleagues, and I got no rejection letters. Nobody wanted to say, no, we're not impressed by you. They always said, we're impressed, but nobody said, we'll hire you. I also was making a decision at that time, do I stay in DC? Where do I go? Do I go abroad? Do I work for the State Department? I did work for the CIA for a year and realized in that process that a government job really wasn't my cup of tea. It was fascinating working for the CIA, but I really wanted something a little bit different. So I'm still searching. And I decided to go back to California. I hadn't gotten a job. Most of my colleagues had, because it's the #1 school in that field in the country, and I should have gotten one, but it wasn't happening. So I came back, and I went through one of the more agonizing years of my life job hunting in San Francisco. I'd go with my friend Felix, and we'd play music on the street, and we made pretty good money. And I'd be out on the street playing guitar down on Ghirardelli Square, and then I'd put on a suit, and I'd go in, and I was always a little worried that some guy I interviewed with in a suit would see me on the street playing music. And eventually I met these guys that ended up hiring me, Larry Butler, Steve Zarate, Ralph Rasmussen. I remember their names because they decided, you tell everybody, I've done all this stuff, I'm a hard worker, I'll show up on time, but I don't have a track record. I mean, I hadn't been a bag boy in a grocery store. I hadn't, flipped burgers. I didn't have much of a job background to speak of other than working at the camp and at the CIA. So it was really hard in this vicious cycle that you're all facing of the catch-22. How do I get experience so I can tell them I have experience? It's really tricky. These guys believed in me. They hired me, and that really launched my career. The good news in all of that scary process is that I didn't have to interview with or take a job with people who weren't supportive. There was kind of a funny filtering process, which is the people who finally hired me were ones who could see beyond the blindness and look to the person that they wanted to cultivate as a young blind manager. And that's what really started at the Bank of California. From that time on, my decisions were a little different. It wasn't begging for a job, just somebody take me. It was a matter of making some decisions. The next was to join a company in Sunnyvale, ESL, which is now a part of TRW. And that's where I started doing the thing that I really do to this day, which is start up new things. Even at the Bank of California, I was starting up their first ATM machines. This is 1980, 81, and their electronic funds transfer. And this tended to be what I was good at. I hadn't discovered this yet, but that adaptability thing that goes back to age 3 is what really suited me in terms of being an entrepreneur. So I did that first at the Bank of California. Then I left after not much over a year and went to ESL and started up a new business area for them. And that somewhat melded with the work that I'd done at the CIA. Then some of my colleagues, one that I work with to this day, went off to start a company and develop the world's first laser turntable. And he said, well, I think we're going to need a marketing person and need somebody to help raise venture capital soon, but we're just working on the technology to make sure that we think it can happen. And at that point, one of the other huge things happened in my life was I was engaged to be married and got a call from my fiance in Peru, and she said, the wedding's off. She was down there for a year teaching. So I flew down there anyway, and we went to the Galapagos and did some other really fantastic things, but I couldn't talk her back into the marriage happening. So I decided, okay, this is a transition point in my life. I need to go up to the mountains and hibernate and kind of lick my wounds a bit. And I went up to Kirkwood and went skiing, and this is when I ended up going to Sarajevo and doing the Olympics and all of that stuff. So sort of coincidentally fell into the fact that I had time on my hands to be doing those kinds of things. But it was a big decision to leave Sunnyvale and Silicon Valley and deal with the girlfriend thing and go up to the mountains and figure that out. I came back from there and joined the Laser Turntable Company, which turned out to be an amazing experience. Raising the venture capital I talked about, developing the world's first and only laser turntable, and really learning how to fend for myself in a startup company where nobody's going to give you any particular breaks unless you perform. Like Gina was talking about yesterday. They don't give you equipment or go the extra mile unless there's a reason. If you're making lots of money for somebody or you're performing for them, they want to keep you like they would any employee. So that was a fascinating experience at Finial. Eventually, our vulture capitalists kicked us out, and all of a sudden, I was in a position, I was fired. I had a really nice severance, so I had about a year to play, and I skied and I went to Chile and did all kinds of fun things, but I was really thinking about, what do I do now? What's the next big decision? I remember sitting up in Mount Shasta camping with some other friends who'd also been at the company and said, what do we do? What do we invent? Do I stick with another startup company, or do I go back to a regular paycheck? That was a tough decision to be making with a company, with my life at that point. A regular paycheck would have been nice. Startup companies, you're the last person that gets paid if you're doing that, or maybe you don't get any pay for a while. And we came up with everything, and I remember one thing was we wanted to have some sort of camping dishwasher. It's a lot of work schlepping your stuff down to the lake and rinsing it out and getting it clean when you don't have warm water. That never came to fruition, but we thought about it a lot. I did decide to stay with the startup world, and I moved to San Francisco, and at that point I was engaged again, and I had decided that if I was starting a new company, I wanted to move to the coolest place I could think of, not in terms of temperature, but a neat place to live, before the company started, because once you get somewhere, it's really hard to move everybody. So we moved to Ashland, Oregon, and started up what was called Maytech Sports. And we developed something called the Bun Warmer. And the Bun Warmer was a heating cushion that you sit on or you put under your jacket when you're in a cold weather stadium like Buffalo or Green Bay to warm yourself up at a football game. It still exists. The modern iteration of that is the hand warmer. And so we spent a lot of money developing that, and I went around to all these football stadiums around the East Coast, and what I didn't realize was that the NFL does not license products unless they get a big piece of the action. The only stadium that has independent concessionaires is Buffalo. Everybody else goes through the NFL organization. So by the time I figured that out, and that we weren't going to get any business with them, we'd run out of money. And this is one of those decision points. Do I put in more money? Do I go find a job with a paycheck? What do I do? Well, one of the things I realized in Ashland, Oregon that people do, in order to live in a cool place, sometimes you've got to have multiple jobs. And it's amazing up there, people who were lawyers or accountants, they become construction workers and painters, and they have 2 or 3 or 4 jobs because they want to just make a living in order to live in a place that has a nice quality of living. And I was looking at my friends who were in Silicon Valley, and they were making a lot of money, 6-figure salaries, but their life seemed to me pretty uninteresting. They just worked 16 hours a day and didn't go anywhere because they slept on the weekends. I thought, here, I'm in Ashland, Oregon. It's beautiful. There's sports. There's cool people. There's entertainment. There's culture. I'm going to stay here. It doesn't matter what it takes. So I started a couple of other things. We had bought this thing called the flexible film cassettes. film cassettes go around pipes to x-ray them, as opposed to the rigid cassettes where somebody takes a picture of your broken arm. And who'd think of that kind of product? But somehow I ended up with that thing in my basement, along with the anaerobic chamber where we're making the bun warmers. And then I hooked up with this blind guy in Ashland, Bill Ballou, and we formed customized computer systems. And we had our first adaptable computers that we were configuring for people back in 1991. So I had 3 job things going on at the same time. And that was right in line with what happens with a lot of people, as I said, in Ashland, Oregon. And that's what I had to do to make a living. Those products kind of got by, but eventually, weren't really going anywhere huge. And I happened to be on a flight to a convention. I think it was an ACB convention in, 94, 93. And I sat next to, in Chicago, yeah. I sat next to Jim Fruchterman from Arkenstone, and we'd never met, didn't know who he was. We just happened to sit next to each other on an airplane. You notice a common theme in my life? You fly enough, you meet the right people. So just start flying. And by the end of the flight, he said, well, if you ever decide to leave Oregon, give me a call. Well, it happened the next week. I got a call from Telesensory, which was the biggest adaptive company in the industry back then, and they had fired their general manager, and they said, would you come interview? And I thought, well, what the heck? Might as well check it out. The last thing I want to do is move back to Silicon Valley, but I do need to feed my family, my kids. I was just starting to have kids then. So I went down, interviewed with them, and it was really hard to get from Ashland to Palo Alto. You've got either to go over to Klamath Falls and take a train, or if you fly last minute, it costs a fortune. I actually found out it was cheaper to charter a small plane and have him pop me around from place to place than it was to pay United to take me. It was like $1,100 on United, and it was $800 for this individual plane, which was a lot in the 90s. But it was really fun to have this guy pick me up in Ashland. We flew to San Carlos, we flew to Oakland, we flew to Chico, all these places. I think, these people that have helicopters and small planes, it's the only way to go. And I had an assistant at the time, a young woman, and I decided I would pay for her to get her pilot's license, just so I would have somebody to fly me around. And she got about halfway through that before I decided to come back to Silicon Valley. I didn't take the job at Telesensory, but I did take the one at Arkenstone. So I kind of bailed on my entrepreneurial side of things, and I left the wonderful quality of life in Oregon, and I made that really scary decision to come back down. And I remember having all of our friends over to our 10-acre place out in the foothills of Ashland, and leaving the party and going back in my room and just sobbing, thinking, I cannot believe I'm leaving all of these friends and this lifestyle, this house that we've been in for 6 years, to go back to Silicon Valley in the rat race. I did it, and it was a good experience. It really introduced me to a big part of my life now, which is the GPS stuff, because Strider was the prototype that we were just starting to develop back in 1994 when I went to Arkenstone. That lasted for about 3 or 4 years until Arkenstone said, this is not going anywhere. We're spending a ton of money developing it, and the market just isn't ready for GPS yet. So they canceled the project. And I really still believed in it. So I said, okay, I'm going to spin off a company, and I worked this out with Jim Fruchterman, and I left to start Sendero Group. In the process, I also decided I've got to find some place that's a compromise between Silicon Valley and Ashland, Oregon, because I got to get out of the rat race. And that's how I chose Davis, California, with good transportation, close access to the airport and to Amtrak, and to the mountains to go skiing. It was really an ideal compromise. So lots of lifestyle decision-making that I had to make, and it sounds simpler than it was. A lot of these things would take weeks or months to decide upon. Certainly leaving a regular paycheck at Arkenstone to go back to a startup, and now I don't have the severance that I got when I left the previous company to fund what I'm doing. It was pretty scary to be going out there starting a company on a song and a prayer. But I did that and moved to Davis. I commuted for a while to Arkenstone and sort of wound down things there while I was winding up Sendero. And launched that company in late '99. And boy, it wasn't too long before we were out of money. Rehab wouldn't buy GPS for clients. They thought it was just Mike May on his crazy soapbox back then. Schlepping around my backpack, 13-pound backpack with a laptop and a GPS in it. And thank goodness we started applying for grants. And one of them actually came through eventually. And this was monumental in the evolution of my company, because I was getting to that point where I was going to have to say, time to throw in the towel. I did have a blind guy from Denver who really believed in this, Jim Meisner, who was one of the original investors in Sendero and into the GPS, and was really fundamental in making that happen, because at least I had a little bit of income and wherewithal to develop the company from back then. But eventually a grant came through. We'd teamed up with 5 universities, and after 9 grants being turned down, this National Institute for Disability Research, which is part of the Department of Education, came through, and we were able to fund Sendero and start the GPS that you know and love today. It really started from that grant. If that hadn't come through, we couldn't have gone on with what we've done. Since then, we've gotten a number of other grants that have funded it, and we've made a number of different transitions as we go forward, figuring out how to go from the laptop to the Braille Note to the Braille Sense, now to the iPhone, and all these different platforms that we're talking about. A lot of tough decisions in that process of Sendero. So it's now 11 years old, and of course, the question is, well, what now? Well, there's still a lot to be done. I'd say only a small percentage of people have GPS. It's not as affordable as we would like. A lot of people are saying, when are we going to have a full Sendero application on the iPhone? And I always say, well, how much are you willing to pay for it? But we realize that there's a real interest there, and it's something we'd like to do if we can fund it and make the business part of it work. That's a tough one. And there's a lot of other stuff to do. I think indoor navigation is the next huge frontier, and the real holy grail for an entrepreneur, particularly if you're working in the blindness field, is something we call dual use. So anytime something can be used for a blind person and a sighted person both, then we finally get the affordability factor. So when you have a Braille display, you're not going to have any sighted people wanting a Braille display. And that technology doesn't have any crossover to be used for something else. So Braille displays are just like they've always been, $2,000 to $7,000. That doesn't change. But what if you can come up with technology that's dual use? Then you're talking. Then it's a technology that can make money in the sighted markets and then be cheap for blind people. So I accomplish 2 things. I make money, and I do something that's cool for myself and for my blind friends. So that's what I'm looking into, and I think we'll see where that goes going forward. And one other thing I'd mention, since I said I'd be honest with you guys in chapters of my life, what's coming next. I'm moving today. That's always a huge thing anytime you move house. So I'm leaving here, going to Davis, starting to pack up a truck and just moving across town. That's a result of, and of course because a lot of you have read Crashing Through and know many more details about my life than I know about yours, I'll share with I'll share with you the fact that I'm in the middle of getting divorced. Oh. Not something that I would normally announce to an audience, but as my advisors have told me before, manage the information. As I started hearing from, you hear from people things like, I thought I saw Mike May with so-and-so, and well, I'm divorced, and so, what else goes along with that? You start dating, you start meeting new people, life is on a new chapter. One of the things I decided I would never accept, and it's a really hard thing to implement, is mediocrity. So in a relationship or a job, if things start seeming mundane or mediocre, it's probably time to move on. And sometimes you can do it yourself, sometimes, take somebody else to kick you in the butt to do it, but that's what's happening in my life. I don't want my relationships, personal or professional, to get mediocre. I've got to stay alive. And that's something that's really in the heart and the mind and in how we operate. It's not just in whatever age we are. We can be old and stodgy at 19, or we can be old and stodgy at 58. Let's all be young at heart and innovative. It's an opportunity that all of us have, and I share with you this personal information really because I want to demonstrate that in order to get to the good stuff, you got to wade through some of this other crap in the process. Yeah, so that's where I'm at right now. Thank you, and I'll take any questions if you have any. Thank you. Come on by. We can carry some couches.
I don't think so.
Okay, yeah. You guys got your work cut out for you here. Any questions?
Is there a roving mic?
Sorry?
Hold on a sec.
Oh, we have a roving mic.
Mike, this is Dexter. I still want to know, I asked yesterday and someone kind of cut you off, about the process of one of your ventures, one of your entrepreneurial ventures in terms of from idea to product. Where you got the idea from, how you got funded, if you care to share something way back then, how much you probably made from it, where it probably went wrong. I'd love to know about that.
Well, I think I've covered that to some extent, Dexter, in being at Mount Shasta and figuring out what do I do next, coming up with a bun warmer. Part of the idea selection is you go through hundreds of these things before you find something that strikes your fancy and that also seems like there is a market. I mean, there's a lot of cool ideas, but how do you turn them into something? That's the tricky part. You've got to find funding, or you've got to find that you have the resources to hang out for a year or two before you get paid. That's really a big part of it. But you have to do some serious market analysis and not get sidetracked. You have to look at who else is doing similar things. So there's a lot of market analysis, a lot of resource analysis that goes into looking at an idea before you even go anywhere with it. So I'll use the indoor navigation as an example. Obviously, there's a demand. There's a need for a product that'll take you through some complicated government building to the office that you want to get to. Blind and sighted people need that. There would be a real need for the fact that you could pull up a recipe on your iPhone, and then you just follow what the iPhone tells you. You go to the specific place in the store to pick out the items to fill that recipe. People would want that product. It doesn't exist. There is no competition. So now it's a good idea. It hasn't been done. Lots of people are working on it. So how do you get funded to do it is the tricky part. And that's where the real challenge comes in. People often say to me, when I've been involved in these startups, they say, well, how can you be in a startup, that's so risky? And I think, how can you work for AT&T or Lockheed or HP? It seems really risky. They lay you off. Bank of America, how many people are they laying off? They're consolidating. Everybody's having to do this. So I don't know that doing these other things is any riskier. You just have to be smart and work hard, and that's what it takes from idea to implementing these things. And then how much money do you make from it? In the early days of startups, I wanted to make my millions. Then I decided I want quality of life and a decent income. And the independence that comes from being my own boss and being able to pick the people I work with is a very high priority for me. So as long as I have a reasonable living and I can get my kids through college and so forth, I'm good. I don't need to hit the home run. I'll take a single or a double.
Good morning, Mike. Charles Jackson here. Quick question, and I hope this isn't off the topic, but as an inventor and business person who develops products primarily for the blind and visually impaired, how do you see the iPhone and particularly the pricing, low budget, the low number, low pricing of the iPhone applications impacting your ability to develop and actually make money from very specialized applications that you market and sell, that are generally fairly expensive because, they're not too much, some of them are not crossover, some of them may be. But do you see that as negatively impacting kind of the long-term kind of R&D and the viability of you making products for this marketplace?
Right. I think about that a lot. We've talked about that a lot. It's a very good point. The iPhone really presents some weird problems. It does negatively impact companies doing accessible versions of things. It's great if the particular application is dual use. That's great, because then you can get it for 99 cents or $29. But for companies to go to the trouble of developing something specialized for the blindness market, it's a disincentive, because now blind people aren't going to pay $500 for an iPhone app, which would be cheap in terms of buying things like a BookSense or a Stream, or $500 is common, but on an iPhone it's not common. So you've got something that in some ways is bad for blind people. But it is what it is, and the iPhone is a strange beast because it's hard to operate, but yet people are going through this difficult learning curve because it's cool. It gives them access to a sighted world of applications that we've never had before. So it gives us something that's worth fighting for, worth struggling for, and that's why people are dealing with it. And I've really been educating myself as I use the iPhone to try to figure out, why is it that people like this damn thing? It's really a pain in the neck, but I'm understanding now that I'm doing it and I'm talking to other people, and there's no denying the fact that it's not just early adopters. There's lots of people, a lot of blind people with iPhones. So whether we like it or not, or it's negative, or we don't like the model, we're stuck with it. So I'm going to figure out a way. That's really where I've come to. We've got to figure out a way to fund it, to make it work. I don't know if it'll be a $500 application. If we can get somebody to underwrite it, it might be less. But there's got to be a way to do a specialized application. And I'm always thinking of ways that it's dual use. Is there something about an app that we can develop that would be useful to sighted people as well? Because a lot of the mainstream GPS applications don't do pedestrian stuff that well. So maybe we can do something that sighted people would pay for as well.
Mike, Dan here. I've known you a long time. I've probably known you longer than virtually everybody, except my siblings, and I still keep in touch with you. And I never realized. Well, I keep in touch with my siblings too. But I never realized how on the edge you lived. I mean, I thought I lived on the edge when I called you from Hawaii and said I'm homeless and I need to work at camp, and you said you're hired, come on up. So that saved my butt. But I never realized you were in the same boat half the time. So I mean, I don't think you were homeless at all, but you were, sounds like, on the edge, and that's not a good feeling. But it apparently, you've got to flip to the flow or you're not going to get anywhere, and that's just part of getting somewhere is to live on the edge and take a chance and take a risk. But my question to you is, with the emerging new technology of wraparound polymers and where you're going to be able to have wraparound monitors, really thin, and where do you see that going in terms of braille displays and lower pricing on computer products?
Probably that's a long a question. It's a bit off topic, and I'd love to talk about it a little bit more later. I think we just have a couple minutes here, so I want to stick to the scary edge. You did mention beyond the edge, but from there on into technology, it's a little different approach. So any other questions?
We'll take one more from Dean here.
My question is, why is it, like, for example, when I was looking at the iPhone and I was looking at the Sense View magnifier, I was thinking, wow, this iPhone could have been used as a magnifier. Why pay $700 for video magnifier when you can just use the iPhone's camera as the same thing, because it's about the same size? So my question is, why don't more visually impaired blind people come up with ideas like that? Because they already know how to use some of those equipment, how those equipment are used. Why don't they adopt it rather than using dual use, adopt to what's already existed that regular people use and use the technology? That's how another way is to make the application cheap. I don't understand. I mean, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I came up with that idea. And so I'm just wondering why no visually impaired people will come up with ideas like that. It's like, well, there's a technology.
Dean, I think, let me stop you for 1 second, because we just have about 2 minutes, and I think what we need to do is have a technology session next go round. I'll close with one quick story. Since Dan mentioned Beyond the Edge, it reminds me of a Warren Miller movie that I was in, and this is the kind of thinking that you've always got to be coming back to when you're making these tough decisions. I went out to Aspen, Colorado to be in a mainstream speed skiing event, and the problem I always ran into with speed skiing was the insurance companies wouldn't allow it when they heard a blind person was going to do it. But they paid for the trip, and Ron and I went out there, and I didn't sleep the night before. I got butterflies. I'm ready to go down this hill. I thought it was finally going to happen. And 5 minutes before we're going to go on this speed skiing course, the president of the resort, John Reel, comes up to me and he says, "Mike, I'm really sorry, but here's a fax we just got from the insurance company." And he read it, and it says, if the blind guy goes out of the starting gate, then the insurance for Aspen and Snowmass are canceled for the season. And he said, "I can't take that risk. You can't go." And Warren Miller, who was standing next to me, he's filmed people all over the world doing crazy stuff, jumping out of burning gondolas. He's dealt with this. So wacky insurance companies are really not a problem for him. So he immediately thought of what I should have thought of. And so I remind myself of this to this day, and I remind you to be thinking this way. Warren very simply said, "Well, then don't go out of the starting gate, go right below it." So that's what I did. I went below the starting gate. We didn't break the rule. I got to be in the speed skiing event, and it was done, So go for it. Keep thinking about that. There's always a way. And when you get knocked down, start thinking of the solution right away rather than bemoaning what has happened. Thanks again.